Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the Reflections on Emerald Hills of the Heart. Today our topic is language, thought, scriptures, and science. Now we are in the sacred, blessed months of the year, approaching Ramadan. And our guest again is Dr. Zaman Stanizai, from Professor at the Pacifica Graduate Institute and California State University, to talk about scriptures and science. Welcome, Dr. Zaman Stanizai.
Thank you for inviting me. I hope you're not expecting me to talk about science and scriptures, because that's going to take lifetimes. But we are going to address one small aspect of it, which is languaged thought. The critical part of the title is language used as a verb, languaged thought. And we are going to discuss it from two perspectives, scriptural and scientific. And the scientific is, of course, linguistic perspective, and the scriptures are limited to the Quran and the Bible. If there is a true miracle in the known universe, it has to be the human language, the innate capacities of language. There's nothing more complicated and nothing more impossible to understand than the human language. Let me clarify that. We are not talking about one of the 6,000 or so languages that human beings speak around the earth, not that language. We are rather talking about the ability of the human being having language as a sense and as a skill. And generally there are two theories about how language developed, or how did we become aware of it. The first theory is that humans have evolved and have developed language as a skill and as a means of communication with each other. So language is perceived as a skill, as an acquired skill from the environment. And it's a part and parcel of the human experience that is defined by the familial and geographic environments. That's one view. Another view of language, speaking more scientifically, is that humans were born with an innate capacity to think in language, to reason, to question. And this innate development happens before we are born. So in that sense, humans are hardwired with language. And the outer manifestation of that, which is the skill, comes to life after we are born, and what Noam Chomsky calls language universals, which is talking mostly about the human capacity to acquire a language, no matter how sophisticated. We can learn it in the first few years of our life with complete fluency and a complete understanding of whatever grammatical, syntactical, semantic, other characteristics a language may have. Now, similar to those two scientific perspectives, there are two scriptural references to language as well. The first one is the biblical one, which is from Genesis 2:19, that after God creates humankind, the Bible reads, "Now the Lord God had formed out of the ground all the wild animals and all the birds in the sky." It's the next part that's the critical one. "He brought them to the man to see what he would name them. And whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name." So we are assuming that this naming would have to make a reference to the language as a skill. So the man gave names to all the livestock, the birds in the sky, and all the wild animals. Then we have a second reference, not too far distance after the first one. This is in Genesis 3:20. That is, after Adam's companion is made from his left rib. Again, the Bible reads that Adam named his wife Eve because she would become the mother of all the living. Now, never mind the fact that Eve was named only after she committed the sin of eating from the forbidden fruit tree. And in a way, it became kind of secondary even after the animals, but that's a different issue. We also have to pay attention to the fact that there was language before that when God commanded things into existence. So as far as the divine perspective is concerned, or the divine viewpoint, if we can use that term there, then language was there before Adam. And in this case, Adam sort of acquired it. Now, the important thing here is that in the biblical perspective is that language was initiated by Adam as a human being. That Adam, on his own initiative, after God brought all the animals before him, he started naming them, sort of giving them an identity, identifying them. And so that would be the beginning of the human language. It also implies that it was more of an experience thing, that that Adam came in contact with his environment, and he named the animals, and perhaps that's how language evolved. In short, language is a learned experience. So in this case, the biblical version matches the first scientific perspective, which is talking about language as a learned experience. So if the biblical Adam learned language, human language must have been with us pretty much from the beginning. So the problem here we have is that linguists such as Noam Chomsky tell us that that even if we, he doesn't tell you this, but that's what I'm throwing in there, is that even if we converted the biblical timeline into a historical timeline, Chomsky believes that there is no evidence of human language as a form of communication before 70,000 years. In other words, this is a much recent phenomenon in the development of humanity and the evolution of humanity, that before 70,000 years, we did not have a language as a means of communication, that there are no signs and there's no evidence of that. Now, let's turn to the Quranic version. And here it's important to note that the biblical Adam is the first human being, whereas the Quranic Adam is not the first human being. Rather, it is the human being that evolved and attained consciousness much later. The Quran repeatedly refers to when the Quran uses the word khalaqa, to create, the word after that is always insan, the creation of humanity. But when there is reference made to Adam, the Quran never uses the word khalaqa. It never uses the word create, that we created Adam. No, it says jala. In other words, we transformed that human being into Adam. So the Quranic Adam is not the first human being. It is an evolved being that came into existence through evolution through the attainment of consciousness much later. So, but the Quran has, in reference to language, it still uses the word, or rather the name Adam. And Quran's take is different on language than the Bible and then the first scientific one. It is similar to the second scientific theory. That means that humans have been hardwired before birth with language. So that second scientific theory matches the Quranic version, whereas the first scientific theory matches the biblical version. So, and since language is not an experience-based skill that one can learn from its environment, Quran differs from the biblical concept of Adam naming objects. Instead, it's God who empowers Adam to acquire names. In Surah Baqarah, ayat 31, وَعَلَمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا, and he imparted into Adam the names of all things, he being God. In other words, this was not Adam's initiative, but it was God's will to make Adam have the knowledge of things in the form of a language. Now, the term that the Quran uses, asma, which is the plural of ism means name, and it implies, according to most philologists, an expression conveying the knowledge of a thing. That's the critical part, conveying the knowledge of a thing. In other words, Adam was simply not parroting and say, well, this is a cow and that's a lion or a bird or whatever. It was not naming, rather, he would have had the knowledge in order for this to become his sense as a language. And it's applied to denote a substance or an accident or an attribute for the purpose of distinction. So when you name one thing one and you give a different name to another, the element of distinction is there. The element of attribute is there, whether it's blue or white or great or small and all the rest of it. So that in philosophical terminology, this would amount to what we call a concept. In other words, the concept of entities and of phenomenon was conveyed to Adam. In other words, it wasn't just naming things, but having the knowledge. In other words, becoming aware of things in his or its environment. From this, it may be legitimately inferred that knowledge of all the names denotes here that humankind's faculty of logical definition and thus of conceptual thinking. Again, the thinking part had to go hand in hand with that. That's why the word knowledge is used in here. Now, Quran is saying that God taught Adam the names of all things. If we make that same assumption as earlier, that the imparting of the names implies language, then for one, we can say that human beings are, to use a modern term, that human beings are hardwired with the skill from birth, or perhaps even before birth, to indicate that language acquisition is not an experience-based skill. And we can also find other references for this in the Quran too. Surah 55, Ar-Rahman, the most beneficent. The first four ayahs read as follows. Ar-Rahman alama al-Quran khalaq al-insan alamahu al-bayan. The most gracious has imparted this Quran unto the humankind. He, God, has created humankind. he has imparted unto him, unto humankind, articulate thought and speech. Now, the Quran jumps back in time into the pre-Adamic times. I'm coining the term here. Remember the distance between God creating humanity, خلق الإنسان, that period, and the time when Adam became Khalifa, the Ja'ala part. Between the Khalaqa and Ja'ala, there is a gap. So Quran is referring to that one, is that the creation of humanity that obviously preceded the transformation of Adam, and it puts humankind between two keywords. Again, in those four ayahs that I read to you, the ayahs in this surah are very, very short. So let me read them one more time. Ar-Rahman, Allama al-Quran, خلق الإنسان علمه البيان. So when you see خلق الإنسان, the creation of humanity, it is preceded and followed by two words, both of which mean language. علم القرآن, the Quran comes before, and علمه البيان, the bayan comes after. Now, Quran is the utter word of God, language, the way God spoke to humanity through Prophet Muhammad. It's the recitation, the reading. You can translate it any which way you want to, but the Quran simply means language in a way, with the message. Bayan is a word that implies thought and speech. And this is the critical part, thought and speech together. So let me share with you the commentaries of scholars who have defined the word bayan that would match our description, or at least I hope that it would match. Now, the term al-bayan is denoting the means whereby a thing is intellectually circumscribed and made clear. That is Raghib's definition. Let me read it one more time. The term al-bayan is denoting the means whereby a thing is intellectually, that's the key word, intellectually circumscribed and made clear. So things are made clear to you because you have understood it through your power of the intellect. Now, Taj al-Arus's definition is similar. It applies to, that the word bayan applies to both thought and speech, in as much as it comprises the faculty of making a thing or an idea apparent to the mind and conceptually distinct from other things or ideas, as well as the power to express this cognition clearly in spoken or written language. A little wordy, but the emphasis is again the same, that the thought is an inseparable aspect of language in itself. And Muhammad Asad is kind of summing these two definitions up by saying that hence, in the above context, the Surah Rahman context that I read to you, in the above context, articulate thought and speech. He is using the word, or adding the word articulate to the equation. The articulate thought and speech, recalling the knowledge of all the names, i.e., the faculty of conceptual thinking with which humankind is endowed. And in this sense, again, all three sources to which I refer to for a definition, so that what I'm saying, if it sounds a little too new to some of you, you would understand that I'm not just throwing words there, but they are penned in scholarship. So let's explore the existence of the innate skills in a fetal stage, since we, in a way, concluded, or at least I did, that the knowledge of language as speech and thought is innate, and it's in the human, it's born with the humanity. And if it's born with the humanity, it implies that it must have existed before we were born. And that's why I'm going to an analogy with the fetus. A fetus is so totally dependent on the mother that its connection to the umbilical cord takes care of all its needs, such as hunger, taste, whatever else. Now, yet a baby is born with a sense of hunger without experiencing it. Now, the experience comes in this world when we kind of live in the physical world and we experience things, but not the fetus, because the fetus is in the womb, and whatever it needs, all it needs are answered through that umbilical cord. So whether it needs food, it gets it without calling for it, without experiencing hunger, because the word hunger will be totally irrelevant in that environment. And it's not recognized and it's not experienced. However, in the earliest minutes after the birth, the baby feels hungry. Now remember, it is not an experienced sense. But when the need arises in the first few minutes, the baby is hungry and starts calling for food. And that's because the sense of hunger already exists in the lateral hypothalamus, and it is fully functional, and it's being put through its first experience. And many of the other senses have also already developed in the various contexts, or in the very cortex or cortices of the baby, or the baby brain. So the baby's lips are looking for its mother's nipples, and it's mouthing it once again without any previous experience. And they are ready to kind of operationalize that skill or that sense that they were born with. Now, the same thing goes for the sense of taste and many of the other things that, in other words, babies are born with certain innate capacities that have not been experienced. But when the time for experience comes, they are put to work in a way that one would think that they have had experience for a long, long time, like they know how something tastes, or they know when they get hungry, etc., etc. Now, the baby brain is also born equipped with a cortex responsible for language acquisition. That's the part we want to emphasize a little bit. And so if the baby's brain is equipped with a cortex responsible for language acquisition, you may ask, well, if so, then when a baby is born, it should be ready to speak at birth. Well, the language part that has to do with the reason, with intellectual, that part is there and it's functional. The only missing component is the articulation. That is the sounding of the words, the forming of the words and the sentences and so on. So that part is missing. But the actual part that has to do with the reason, with the intellect, with the logic, that part is already there. So if then we can conclude from this that the human language is first and foremost an innate skill and sense that develops in the womb, there obviously is no need for a dialogue in the womb. So we can say, like, wait a minute, so why was this sense developed in the womb of the mother when there was no need for it, because the baby had no one to dialogue with? we can conclude from this, or postulate from this, that yes, that's right, there was no need for a dialogue, but that the dialogue was preceded by a monologue, that the language skill is the logos, or what we call in Arabic mantiq, which is tightly connected with natek or nutq. In other words, in the Arabic language, the word for language and the words for logic and reason are derived from the exact same root. And all the arguments we have been making based on the Quranic scripture is that the word bayan and the word Quran imply the same thing. That the reasoning part of it is there with it. And humans are born with their brain developed with the power of reasoning right there. However, in the conventional sense, we refer to reasoning when it is languaged in articulation, when words are spoken, when it's expressed in a particular human language. We forget that babies, children, the fetus doesn't have to speak out to know what is what. In other words, they think. When they look at the face of these two strange faces that usually get close to them and making all kinds of nonsense noises and sounds like that, the baby is very, very smart and knows that these two faces must belong to some people who might be very important. Baby can't say mama or papa, it doesn't matter. But the thinking part of it is there. So in that case, bayan is applied to both language and thought, in as much as it comprises the faculty of making a thing or an idea apparent to the mind and conceptually distinct from other things or ideas, as well as the power to express this cognition clearly in spoken or written language. I don't want to speak more in a kind of a scientific jargon, but the idea is that yeah, there are two scientific concepts or theories and two scriptural one, and they kind of match one to one. But then after we are born, it's the familial and geographic environment that determines whether we end up speaking Pashto or Portuguese for that matter. That is this communication language, which comes later. And that language is language insofar as our relationship with others is concerned. But in the womb, we don't have that need. So when a person needs a monologue and at the prelingual stage, that monologue is in a sense a dialogue. And the dialogue implies that someone must be talking with someone else, that there are two entities. So who is the partner in this dialogue? And I'm talking about the prelingual dialogue, the dialogue with the other entity. And the other entity is God. If that throws you off, just give me a chance. One might think like, oh yeah, if you're quoting the Bible and the Quran, you must be having this strictly religious perspective on the issue. But the thing is that we often have a problem with God because we do not define it in terms of our modern understanding. And that's why it may sound a little awkward as to what God is. Scientists have proven that there is a cortex for God in the human brain. This has been experimented with. And they have found out that there are certain parts of the brain that for people who believe in God, during prayer, during connecting with that other reality, that part of the brain for a believer acts differently than the one for a non-believing person. And by non-believing, I mean not believing in God. We all believe in some kind of other reality. And so just as the language part is innate, inborn in the brain, there is a part of God also in the brain. It's called the God part of the brain. That is discussed in a book of that same title. The title is The God Part of the Brain, written by Matthew Alper, and it has gained critical acclaim from some of the world's leading scientists. That's important. The acclaim from the world's leading scientists and secular humanists, as well as theologians. And it's a good read. And in this case, it's been pondered that the question of God's existence as well as the meaning of our own. So Alper presents a stunning argument that our brain is hardwired to believe in a God. He offers a scientific explanation that we inherit an evolutionary mechanism that allows us to cope with our greatest fears, with our greatest terror, which is death. We know we are all afraid of dying because we don't know what's on the other side. So, what does the Quran say about this? What the God part of the human brain? We go to this next surah, and here I think this is from Al-An'am, Surah Ayah 63. I'm not sure if it's there, but yeah, that's what I think where it is. Okay, and I'm going to read only that small part that has to do with our discussion. فطرة الله التي فطر الناس عليها. That in accordance with the natural disposition which God has instilled into humankind. That people who turn to the left and to the right, the ayah says, and so set thy face steadfastly towards the one ever true faith, turning away from all that is false, inviting God, people into the worship of God. And in there, it says that you do that, you turn towards God in accordance with the natural disposition which God has instilled into humankind. Now, here, the term fitra is defined, described, or translated as natural disposition. Connotes in this context humankind's inborn intuitive ability to discern between right and wrong, true and false, and thus to sense God's existence and oneness. Now, there is also a quotation from the Prophet saying that every child is born in this natural disposition. It is only his parents that later turn him into a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim. Now, these three religions, of course, the Prophet referred to them because they would have been familiar to the people around him. But they also have the formulations best known to the contemporaries of the Prophet that are contrasted with what is called the natural disposition, the fitra. So by definition, it consists in humankind's instinctive cognition of God and self-surrender, which is what Islam means, self-surrender to the divine. Now, if humans are genetically predetermined to develop a sense of natural disposition, the fitra, and if the language cortex has already developed in the womb before we are born, then it should not surprise anybody that the prelingual thought The language part of the unborn is engaged just like many of the other senses of the unborn, like the reaction to light, to cold, to warmth, to music, to sound, to discomfort. In other words, the fetus inside the mother's womb might be connected through the umbilical cord to the body of the mother. But the fetus is participating in its environment in as much as it's possible. There are mothers who have reported that with the soothing music, the baby is comfortable. With the noisy, let's say, Metallica rock music, it becomes uncomfortable, jumpy. Maybe it wants to dance, I don't know. But the point is that it reacts to the environment so it can hear. In other words, the senses are functioning. So when God invites the human to engage in a monologue or dialogue, there's no reason or prerequisite for this to happen in the womb as well. Of course it could happen. So when prophets tell us that they have received the wahy, the revelation, God spoke to them. How? Did anyone else hear God? Was there an utterance? Was there a vibration in the airwave? Probably not. So how did God speak to the prophets? Well, we have that capacity. I'm sure you have heard people who walk around and talk to themselves. I do it all the time when my cat is not home. Well, people might think I'm talking to myself, but I'm talking to myself because I'm thinking, because I'm analyzing, because I'm questioning, because I'm discussing, or because I'm making an outline for the presentation I'm sharing with you right now. These all happened through a monologue. And that monologue, there is also a partner. That partner is the same in my analysis and critical thinking when I do prayers. So when I'm praying, who am I talking to? That is a dialogue. But because you don't see the visible other entity in the conversation, you could say it's a monologue. So it doesn't matter. Monologue, dialogue. In other words, there is a God within us. God is within us. And we do talk to God like we do through prayers and supplications and sometimes even anger and complaint and all that. And since language is not an experience-based sense, then there is no reason to say that a fetus is also monologuing or dialoguing with God before the baby is born. Because if the other senses of the baby, if the other cortexes of the fetus's brain are functional and operational, then there is no reason why we should say that the God part of the brain and the language part of the brain that have already developed in the fetus before birth, that they could not be engaged in what they are made to engage in. And the Quran is giving us that assurance in another ayah of the Surah Baqarah, ayah number 152. The Quran says, God Almighty says, Fazkuruni azkurkum. So remember me, and I shall remember you. This is the Quranic God, the interactive God. This is the God that is a partner with you in every aspect of your life. This is not a God like some old man up and above the clouds somewhere in the skies, or someone that you should fear and all that. No, this God is within you, and it's interacting with you, and it's speaking with you, and it's dialoguing with you, and it is inviting you into a dialogue. فَاذْكُرُونِي أَذْكُرْكُمْ وَاشْكُرُوا لِي وَلَا تَكْفُرُونَ. So remember me, and I shall remember you, and be grateful unto me, and deny me not. And deny me not means don't hang up on me. Don't put down the receiver. Keep talking. Keep monologuing. I am listening. And there are many other ayahs which says, listen to me, ask me, I will deliver, I will give you, talk to me. If we use the human perspective, yes, sometimes God does experience a kind of loneliness, and we are invited into that. That loneliness is not any deprivation or isolation, but rather the Almighty, this interactive Quranic God. Now remember, that's the great distinction that most Muslims forget. Non-Muslims may not have access to Quran. They may not have dialogued with the Quran. And so there are many Muslims who follow the God concept of older religions. The Quranic concept of God is not that. God is not somewhere out there that you go to. God is within you, and God is inviting you into a dialogue. And that's why there's a great departure from that traditional sense of seeking God elsewhere. God shouldn't be sought anywhere else other than the human heart. But the problem is that we look for God everywhere except in our human hearts. And for those who dialogue with God internally, if we see them talking to themselves, we often think that they are crazy. Something is wrong with them. But the point is, nothing is wrong with them. They might be just monologuing with the divine. That would be the God of the prelingual or the non-lingual stage or state. Just the same way as we can see the words I told you earlier, the connection between reason and language having the same roots in the Arabic language, nutq, natiq, mantiq. The same thing goes with the roots of the word logos, or logic or language that comes from the Greek. Again, they're all connected. So these were not something that were put there accidentally. That early humans, other than what we think, because we don't give them really credit, we think we are the ones who know everything. The early humans, at the time these languages were formed, at least the two examples I gave you from the Greek and Arabic, that there is a close connection. And the reason I used Greek is simply to tell you that the Arabic roots of the reason and language are not just accidental, that perhaps a similar relationship exists with other languages too. So, if we are born to think, what is the difference between the thinking after the birth and the one before? Well, you could say that after birth, sometimes we think loudly. That is when we verbalize the thought processes of the language. Remember, language, thought, and language going together in the concept of bayan. So just as we can reason unless it is languaged first. In other words, we have gotten so used to this verbalization that often we do not think of language as an entity that includes reason with it. We think that reason is something different. Language is simply for communication, asking someone for a cup of coffee or to move out of your way or something like that. No, that's not it. The thing is that the way we look at it now, you cannot reason unless you create a syllogism in which language is involved, whether it is cause and effect or conclusion or analysis or anything. In other words, we still use language to understand concepts. That early humans must have been happy to keep that within, to monologue. As Chomsky says, that if there's no evidence of the human language in the communicative sense, by communicative I don't mean in these times of Corona, don't get alerted that not as a means of communication, but that human beings, the hunters, gatherers who may have been walking in the woods and among the trees and all that, they must have been making some noise. They must have been talking. Again, it was not necessary for another to be there. And in the context that we are discussing, perhaps they were talking to God, whatever concept they may have had of God, which was, of course, distorted later by people with power and all the rest, which is a different discussion. And only later, then, when humans developed communities as part of their group behavior, the language that contained both language and reason, the emphasis became more of a language as a means of communication. And so in this case, language was kind of externalized, and that the dialogue with the God became a dialogue with another human being who was helping you with the hunting or whatever else the early human environment may have demanded. So the language as a thought process solely and slowly and gradually was replaced by a language for communication only. And with this externalization, even God was now externalized and sought outside of ourselves instead of within ourselves, the point I referred to earlier. Thus, with the divine objectivized, its divinity faded in the human perception, and language primarily became a means of communication. Yet, the innate nature of language and its capacity and complexities to perceive abstract concepts keeps language still the most miraculous phenomenon in creation. That things that we do now, it's so magical that you see there are two human beings, for example. One is that they're sitting 2 meters apart, and each one of them is making noises. Sounds come from their mouths. And if a third party observes them, they're like, why are they sitting and why are they making these noises and why are they kind of taking turns and all that? But if one could understand their language, that they are talking about a very complex phenomenon. They are talking about love. They are talking about hatred. They are talking about, say, food, politics. They are talking about a lot of things. In other words, without these two people moving away from one another, they are communicating to each other concepts that are so complex, so complicated, so difficult to understand. And as I said, it's a magic that we simply use sounds and articulations, the way we move our tongues, our mouths, and the way we exhale, and we assign meaning to these sounds. And we have developed this system through which we use, let's use the English language as an example of, the subject and the verb, the predicate and all the rest of it in a certain order, so that we can all understand the system in which these sounds are not just made haphazardly, but they are made according to certain rules and regulations that would be the syntactical structure of a sentence. That will be the phonological domain of what sounds are acceptable in what language. That will be the semantics, which is what meanings can we encode into certain sounds, and then how to produce them, how to externalize them, how to communicate them. And so in that case, I think that language is still the most miraculous phenomenon, more complicated than anything else we know in creation. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaman Abi, for this wonderful conversation in the language of scriptures and science. It was very beautiful, the analogy of Fetus. I heard a couple of times this Fetus analogy, but now with a different perspective. To hear it like that, to communicate with God, was really wonderful. Thank you for this. And just you were mentioning the monologuing with God analogy there through the fetus. Can we consider this as a kind of a prayer while we monologue, or do you think it as a conversation?
That will take me through a whole other spiel of defining prayer the way I define them. For most people, prayers are when you're in need of something and you present this petition and making all kinds of demands of God, as if God is your servant or orderly or something. No, the concept of, that's a whole other discussion, but just to briefly answer your question is if you use the word dua in Arabic, dua comes from the word dawa. Dawa means invitation. So you invite God into your life. If you have somehow forgotten and had been in ghafla, as we say. And so we invite God into our lives, into our conversation, into our whatever the situation might be. And God is doing the same thing. And it has told us in the Quran. And it says, ask me, fastajibu, or ask me, fad'uni, or ask me, fazkuruni. And it uses different words. God keeps inviting us into the dialogue. And if we use prayer as a dialogue, then we should. And yes, of course, it happens all the time.
Well, thank you for this. We were with Zaman Stanizai, Dr. Zaman Stanizai, from professor at the Pacifica Graduate Institute and California State University, with the program of Reflections on Emerald Hills of the Heart. Today, our topic was language, thought, scriptures, and science. Thank you again.
Thank you.